Imagine standing just a few feet away from your door, holding your breath as shadowy figures circle your house, their muffled whispers barely audible through the walls. You feel the tension rise as their footsteps grow louder, closing in on your only sanctuary. Nowhere to run, no one to call, just the unsettling knowledge that they know you're inside. It started as an ordinary evening, the kind where everything felt still and uneventful. Alone at home, the silence was almost comforting, offering a rare moment of peace. Yet, in the middle of this quiet, a sharp knock at the door jolted everything. It wasn't the time for visitors, not at this hour. Curiosity tugged at you, but instinct kept you still, forcing you to peek through the peephole instead. Two men, standing motionless, their faces blank yet oddly expectant. They didn't look lost or in need of help, they looked like they were waiting. A brief silence hung in the air before one of them spoke, their voice casual yet chillingly direct, asking for people who weren't home, your parents. The mention of their names felt calculated, as if they knew more than they should. Your gut told you not to answer, so you stayed frozen, waiting for them to leave. But instead of retreating to the street, they disappeared into the shadows, leaving no sound of a car starting, no hint of footsteps fading away. It was as if they had melted into the night. Your attempt to move on was futile. Minutes later, the faint crunch of gravel outside the house caught your attention again. This time, there were no knocks. Just the unnerving sound of your backyard gate creaking open and two sets of steps approaching. That's when you realized this was no random encounter. They weren't visitors, they were invaders, testing the boundaries of your home, waiting for their chance. The room seemed to shrink as fear took hold. Every breath felt heavier, every second longer. The quiet tension before they returned to the door felt unbearable. They weren't here to chat. They were here for something, and you could only hope they wouldn't get it. The sound of footsteps outside your house in the dead of night is enough to make your skin crawl. But when those steps stop at your back door, and the soft rattle of the handle echoes through the silence, it feels like time itself freezes. You don't dare move, don't dare breathe, as the realization hits you, they're not leaving. They're coming in. After the men's strange disappearance earlier, you had hoped that was the end of it. But as you sat in the dim glow of your TV, trying to shake off the unease, a faint noise from the side of the house shattered your fragile sense of calm. The unmistakable sound of your backyard gate creaking open sent a jolt of adrenaline through your veins. Heart pounding, you crept toward the window and peeked through the blinds, only to see the same two figures stepping cautiously into your backyard. Their movements were deliberate, too calculated to be random. As they reached the back door, you watched in horror as one of them leaned in, inspecting the lock, while the other stood guard, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. You knew in that moment that this wasn't an act of desperation, it was planned. They were testing, probing, and now they were escalating. Frozen in place, your mind raced with questions. Who were they? What did they want? And most chilling of all, why your house? The answers didn't matter as much as the immediate threat. You grabbed your phone, hands shaking as you dialed 911, whispering your location to the operator. But just as you thought you were doing the right thing, a deafening pop reverberated through the house. The sound of splintering would confirm what you already feared. They had broken in. From your hiding spot in the garage, you heard their footsteps echoing through the house. They moved with purpose, heading directly to the staircase and ascending toward the bedrooms. Every creak of the floorboards above you felt like a countdown. You clutched your phone tighter, listening to the eerie silence that followed their footsteps. Then, a door creaked open upstairs. They had entered one of the bedrooms and closed the door behind them. What were they doing in there? Why that room? Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The sound of sirens in the distance brought a flicker of hope. But it also triggered something in the intruders. Loud, hurried footsteps erupted from above, followed by muffled voices, an argument breaking out between the two men. The sirens grew louder, and you could hear the police entering the house. Relief flooded you, but it was short-lived. The men were still there, somewhere inside, and you had no idea how this would end. Imagine the sound of hurried footsteps breaking the tense silence as the police officers rush into the house. The intruders, realizing they'd been cornered, erupt into a heated argument upstairs. The voices clash, their tones angry and panicked. You, still trembling in the garage, can barely comprehend what you're hearing. What were they arguing about? What could possibly matter to them now, as the authorities close in? Just minutes earlier, you had heard their slow, deliberate movements upstairs. They had entered a bedroom, closed the door, and gone completely silent. The thought chilled you to the core. What were they doing in there? Your mind raced with possibilities, none of them comforting. Every creak of the house amplified your fear as you strained to hear what was happening. When the officers finally reached the second floor, the shouting stopped abruptly. The quiet was almost more terrifying than the noise. From your hiding spot, you could hear the officers commanding the men to show themselves. There was a tense moment of silence, followed by the sound of scuffling, as if the intruders had tried to resist but quickly realized they had no chance. When the police escorted the two men out of the house, you caught a brief glimpse of them through the garage window. Their faces were emotionless, as if they had already resigned themselves to their fate. But what haunted you most wasn't their capture. It was the fact that they said nothing. No excuses, no explanations, no pleas for mercy. Even after the police assured you the house was clear, their silence lingered in your mind. What were they planning? Why had they chosen your home? And why, above all, did they seem more interested in waiting upstairs than in taking anything? As the weeks passed, the answers never came. The authorities could only charge them with breaking and entering, leaving you to grapple with the chilling mystery of what might have been. The piercing silence was shattered by the sudden, unmistakable sound of footsteps. They moved deliberately across the backyard, breaking twigs and crunching leaves underfoot. Then came the loud, deliberate knock at your front door, 3 distinct bangs that seemed to reverberate through your entire body. What followed was even more unnerving: silence. Earlier that evening, as you sat comfortably on the couch, your mind drifted to the odd man who had knocked on your door earlier in the day. His behavior had been strange, leaning to peer into your house instead of engaging in a normal conversation. His abrupt departure had left you unsettled, but now it was clear this wasn't a harmless misunderstanding. Peeking cautiously through the blinds, you saw the man standing on the porch, his figure silhouetted against the faint glow of your porch light. His posture was calm, but his presence was anything but. He wasn't carrying anything, nor did he move toward the door again. Instead, he stood still, staring directly at the entrance as if waiting for you to make the next move. You crept back into the living room, your heart pounding. As you debated what to do, the silence was broken again, not by knocking, but by a distinct scraping sound from the side of the house. You darted to another window, only to see a second figure moving stealthily along the side yard. Your breath hitched as you realized this wasn't just one person, there were two. Grabbing your phone, you dialed 911, whispering urgently to the operator about what you were witnessing. Before you could finish explaining, a loud, jarring crash echoed through the house, the unmistakable sound of glass shattering. The man on the porch was now at the back window, smashing it with something heavy. As adrenaline surged through you, you found a hiding spot, clutching your phone as you waited for the police to arrive. Every second stretched into an eternity, as you listened to the intruders moving through your home. When the sound of sirens finally pierced the air, the men scattered, their plans thwarted. Even after the immediate danger passed, the lingering unease stayed with you. The unanswered questions, why were they there? What were they after? Left you unable to sleep, haunted by the chilling realization that their intentions might have been far worse than a simple break-in. It was the kind of silence that makes you question if you're truly alone. You had been fast asleep, unaware of the shadow standing at your bedroom door, until a single, deliberate knock jolted you awake. Your heart pounded as you stared into the darkness, the stillness amplifying every sound. What was supposed to be a quiet night had taken a sinister turn. Earlier, everything seemed normal. After a long day, you'd settled into your new home, still adjusting to the solitude of living far from the city. The isolation had felt peaceful at first, a welcome escape from the chaos you left behind. That evening, you heard the faint hum of a car engine in the distance. Curious, you peered out the window, catching a glimpse of an old pickup truck navigating the overgrown path toward your house. You froze when it stopped abruptly at the edge of your driveway. The driver lingered for a moment, his face obscured by shadows, before turning around and disappearing into the night. The eerie encounter was unsettling, but you tried to dismiss it. Perhaps it was just someone lost or looking for directions. Yet, deep down, you couldn't shake the unease. A few days later, the truck returned, this time with its headlights off. The sight sent chills down your spine. This wasn't a coincidence. You watched as the man stepped out and slowly approached your porch. He didn't knock or ring the bell. Instead, he just stood there, his silhouette barely illuminated by the faint moonlight. After what felt like an eternity, he turned and walked back to his truck, driving away into the darkness once more. That night, sleep eluded you. Every creak of the old house felt amplified, every shadow seemed to move. When you finally drifted off, the sound of that single knock shattered your fragile sense of security. As you cautiously stepped out of bed to investigate, you noticed the front door was slightly ajar. The realization hit you like a cold wave: someone had been inside. Your pulse raced as you heard soft footsteps retreating down the hallway. Grabbing your phone, you locked yourself in the nearest room and called 911, your voice trembling as you described the intruder. Minutes felt like hours as you waited for help, listening to the sounds of movement throughout the house. When the police arrived, the man had vanished, leaving behind nothing but the chilling memory of his presence. Even as they assured you of your safety, the lingering dread refused to fade. Who was he? And why had he come back? The unknown hung over you like a shadow, turning the isolation you once welcomed into something far more sinister. The moment you woke up, you knew something was wrong. It wasn't the usual groggy disorientation of being pulled from sleep. It was a gut-wrenching certainty that you were not alone. The silence of the house was oppressive, broken only by the faint creak of a floorboard outside your bedroom door. Someone was out there. The day before had been unremarkable. You'd spent hours unpacking and settling into the rental house, grateful for the opportunity to be closer to your brother. The house was modest, but it was quiet and conveniently located, a temporary haven during your visit. After a relaxing evening, you'd gone to bed early, exhausted but content. In the dead of night, a sound pulled you from your sleep, a soft, deliberate knock at the door. Your first thought was that it must be the house settling. But as you listened more intently, you realized the sound was too precise. It wasn't random creaks or groans, it was footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving through the hallway. Your heart raced as you lay still, straining to hear every sound. The footsteps paused, then continued, heading toward your bedroom. Every instinct screamed for you to do something, but fear kept you frozen in place. Suddenly, the door handle jiggled, and you jolted upright. Whoever was out there was trying to get in. You grabbed your phone and locked the bedroom door, whispering into the receiver as you called 911. The operator's voice was calm, but your mind raced with scenarios of what might happen before help could arrive. Outside the door, the footsteps grew louder, then retreated, heading back toward the living room. The faint sound of drawers opening and closing reached your ears, and you realized the intruder was searching for something. When the police finally arrived, you could hear them calling out as they entered the house. Moments later, there was a scuffle, and you knew the intruder had been caught. As you opened the door and stepped into the hallway, relief washed over you, but it was short-lived. The man refused to answer any questions. He didn't explain why he was there or what he was looking for. The officers assured you he wouldn't return, but the encounter left you shaken. What could he have wanted? And why had he chosen your house? Those unanswered questions lingered, turning every creak and shadow into a reminder of how close you'd come to danger. The image of those piercing eyes staring at you from the dark attic is one you'll never forget. It wasn't just the shock of seeing someone up there. It was the sheer disbelief that a stranger had been living above you, watching, waiting, undetected for days. That night had started like any other. You were gaming with friends, enjoying the rare relaxation of a rainy evening with nothing pressing the next day. The downpour outside created a comforting backdrop, and everything felt peaceful, until you heard the first sound. A muffled thump echoed from above, startling you. Initially, you brushed it off, thinking it might be the rain or some shifting roof tiles. But when it happened again, louder this time, curiosity turned into unease. You checked the upstairs rooms carefully. There were no leaks, no obvious source for the noise. Yet something about it didn't sit right. Hours passed, and the rain intensified, but so did your determination to figure out the cause. That's when you noticed the attic window. Covered by branches, it was nearly invisible from outside, but now it stood out in the faint light. You hadn't even realized the house had an attic. You began searching for the hatch, eventually finding it in the closet, so well hidden you'd overlooked it for weeks. When the hatch opened, the musty smell hit you first. A narrow ladder descended, leading to a cramped, dark space. As you cautiously climbed up, flashlight in hand, the beam illuminated a low-ceilinged tunnel stretching into the shadows. And at the far end, crouched on all fours, was a figure, eyes glinting in the light, locked on you. The shock sent you stumbling back down the ladder, heart pounding as you scrambled to call the police. In the driveway, you waited, rain soaking you as you kept your eyes on the house, terrified the figure might follow. When the officers arrived, they found him, a homeless man who had climbed the tree outside and used the attic window to slip inside. He'd been there for days, quietly observing you, sneaking through your space while you were unaware. The absurdity of the situation was almost surreal. You moved out soon after, but the memory of those eyes in the darkness lingers. Every creak in the house, every shadow cast in an unfamiliar space, brings you back to that attic. You'll never forget the feeling of being watched, the realization that someone had invaded your sanctuary without you knowing, and the unsettling question, how long had he been there, unseen, before you found him? The moment you woke up in the dead of night, you knew something was terribly wrong. The eerie silence was heavier than usual, and then you saw it, a shadow moving beneath your bedroom door. Your heart raced as you realized you weren't alone in the house. It had been a long day, as always, juggling 2 jobs and barely finding time to sleep. Exhaustion was your constant companion, but that night, even sleep couldn't shield you from the creeping terror that was about to unfold. You had heard strange noises earlier, soft creaks that seemed to echo throughout the house, but brushed them off as the usual settling sounds of an old building. Until now. The shadow outside your door wasn't your imagination. Someone was in your home, walking the hallways you thought were safe. You froze, listening intently as the faint steps retreated down the hallway. Mustering courage, you opened the door to peer out, catching a glimpse of a figure at the far end of the hall. His eyes locked with yours for an agonizing moment, cold, piercing, and filled with something you couldn't quite define. Fear? Anger? Something darker? Before you could react, he disappeared down the stairs, leaving you paralyzed with terror. You slammed your door shut and locked it, pressing yourself against the wall as you called the police, whispering the details to the operator. Every second felt like an eternity as you waited for help, clutching the phone with trembling hands. When the police arrived, they found evidence that the man had been in the house for days. Footprints, slight disturbances in your belongings, and even signs that he might have been in your room while you slept. They speculated he was hiding, watching, waiting for the perfect moment to act. The thought chills you to this day. The idea that someone had been silently moving through your space, observing your routines, and possibly planning something sinister, has left a permanent mark. You've since moved, but the memory of that shadow, those footsteps, and those haunting eyes lingers. Every creak of the floorboards and every flicker of a shadow reminds you of that night when safety was an illusion, and your sanctuary became a trap. You opened the door cautiously, expecting maybe a neighbor or a lost delivery driver, but the man on your porch was neither. His eyes darted past you, scanning the inside of your house with a piercing intensity that immediately set your nerves on edge. Something wasn't right, and every instinct told you to keep that door shut. It had been a quiet afternoon in your secluded home far from the city, a perfect escape from the chaos of daily life. The solitude was peaceful, but also isolating. When the knock came, it startled you. People didn't just show up unannounced out here, and as you stood in the doorway, staring at this man, the quiet isolation of your home suddenly felt threatening. After a tense moment, he turned and left, climbing into a car parked down the street. You watched until he drove away, unease bubbling in your chest. That night, as you tried to relax in your living room, the sound of voices outside pulled you from the calm. You muted the TV and strained to listen. Two figures were moving across your yard, their conversation muffled by distance but unmistakably deliberate. They disappeared into the shadows, and then silence. Minutes later, the silence shattered with a loud, urgent knock at your front door. You approached cautiously, peering through the peephole to see a man standing there. He was dressed in dark clothing, his face shadowed by a hat. Your heart raced as you realized he wasn't alone. Where was the second man? Then came the sound of something slamming against your back door. The man outside wasn't trying to talk, he was distracting you. Panic set in as you realized you were being cornered. You grabbed your phone and called the police, but the banging continued, first on the back door, then on a side window. Just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The police arrived to find one man still outside, his expression calm but defiant. He refused to answer any questions, his silence more chilling than any threats he could have made. Of the second man, there was no trace, leaving the officers and you to wonder what his role in this unsettling scenario had been. Even now, the thought lingers, what were they planning? Why was your house the target? Was it random, or were you chosen? And most hauntingly, is the one who got away still watching, waiting for another opportunity? The answers remain a mystery, one that keeps you vigilant every time you hear an unexpected knock at the door. You jolted awake, disoriented and confused. The pounding on your bedroom door wasn't a dream, it was real. On the other side stood Terry, the man you were renting a room from, drenched in sweat and filled with an intensity that made your blood run cold. His voice was sharp, almost panicked. "Do not leave your room." He slammed the door shut before you could react, leaving you frozen in fear and confusion. It all started a month ago when you moved into his house. Terry had seemed eager to rent out the extra room. The house was clean, almost unnaturally pristine, and the arrangements seemed straightforward. But as the weeks passed, things started to feel off. Terry was hardly ever home, and when he was, his behavior was erratic. The once perfect house now felt like a facade, its emptiness a reflection of something darker beneath the surface. That night, Terry's sudden outburst shattered any lingering sense of normalcy. You stood by the door, heart pounding, trying to process what had just happened. Then you heard it, the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor downstairs. Gathering your courage, you cracked your door open, just enough to glimpse the dark streaks trailing across the kitchen floor, leading to the garage. You crept down the stairs, careful to stay silent, but the garage door was locked tight. Terry was inside, and the muffled noises coming from the other side of the door suggested he was busy with something you weren't meant to see. Panic overtook you, and without a second thought, you bolted out the front door, jumped into your car, and sped away, calling the police as you went. When the officers arrived, the house was eerily quiet. Terry was gone, and the smears on the floor had been meticulously cleaned, leaving no trace of what had transpired. As the investigation unfolded, more unsettling details came to light. Terry wasn't even the owner of the house, and the lease agreements he'd given you were fraudulent. He had vanished without a trace, his true identity and intentions still a mystery. You couldn't shake the feeling that you had narrowly escaped something terrible. The memory of Terry's wild eyes and the urgency in his voice haunted you long after you left the house. What had he been hiding? Why was he so insistent on keeping you in your room that night? And most chillingly, what might have happened if you hadn't run? You woke up to the sound of footsteps running down the hallway. The thuds were quick, heavy, and unmistakable. Your heart raced as you stared at your open bedroom door, the light from the hallway casting eerie shadows across your room. The realization hit you like a cold wave. Someone had been in your house, and their footprints led directly to your bed. It all began when you moved into a new house for work, sight unseen. It was an older single-story home, with the bedrooms tucked away down a long hallway and the living areas on the opposite side. The layout felt isolating, but you brushed off the unease, attributing it to the stress of the move. Your first night there seemed uneventful, save for the creaks and groans of the house settling. The second night, however, something felt off. You were jolted awake by an odd noise. At first, you thought it might be the house shifting again, but the sound was deliberate, almost rhythmic. As you got closer to the door, the noise stopped. The hallway, now lit by a flickering bulb, stretched into an oppressive darkness. There was no sign of anyone, but an eerie silence hung in the air. Shaking off the nerves, you returned to bed, only to be woken a second time by a loud thump. This time, it wasn't just a sound, it was followed by hurried footsteps. When you opened your eyes, you saw them, footprints in the thin layer of dust on the floor, leading to your bed and back out the door. Whoever had been there was now gone, but their presence was undeniable. Gripping your phone, you called the police while locking yourself in the bathroom. The officers arrived quickly, but their investigation only deepened the mystery. There were no signs of a forced entry, no broken windows, no tampered locks. The only evidence was the footprints, confirming that someone had been inside while you slept. As the days passed, your thoughts spiraled. The unknown visitor hadn't stolen anything or damaged the property. Their motive remained a mystery, but the realization of how close they had been, to your bed, to you, left you shaken to your core. What were they looking for? And why had they come so dangerously close? You couldn't stop wondering what might have happened if you hadn't woken up. The landlord allowed you to break the lease without penalty, eager to keep the incident quiet. Though you left the house behind, the memory of those footsteps and the fear they instilled has lingered, a chilling reminder that some intrusions aren't about what they take, but about what they leave behind. You woke to a single, sharp knock that echoed through the silent house. Sitting bolt upright, your heart thumped in your chest as you strained to hear any follow-up sound. The darkened room felt oppressive, and then you noticed it. The front door was slightly ajar, its gaps spilling faint moonlight onto the wooden floor below. Someone had been inside, and the quiet footsteps now climbing the stairs told you they weren't finished yet. This all started a few months ago, when you moved into your late mother's house after her passing. It was an old barn-style home surrounded by vast, overgrown farmland. The isolation was a stark contrast to the city, but the financial relief of not paying rent outweighed any discomfort. At least, that's what you told yourself. The first unsettling incident occurred late one night. A truck had driven down the overgrown path leading to the house, stopping briefly before turning around and disappearing into the night. It struck you as odd, but you dismissed it, thinking someone had taken a wrong turn. Days later, the same truck returned. This time, the headlights were off, and it parked right in front of your home. The man who stepped out didn't knock or ring the bell. Instead, he stood motionless on the porch, staring at the door as though contemplating something. You watched from the window, frozen, as he eventually turned back to his truck and drove off. The encounter left a pit in your stomach. But the worst came a few nights later. It started with that knock at the door, followed by faint footsteps moving through the house. The realization that someone was inside sent waves of terror through you. Gripping your phone, you slipped into a spare bedroom and dialed 911, speaking in hushed whispers as the intruder's steps grew louder. They climbed the stairs and entered your main bedroom, rummaging through your belongings with an unsettling calmness. The fact that they knew you were home but continued their search was deeply unnerving. Moments later, the footsteps receded, and the front door creaked open and closed. You peered out a window just in time to see the man walking into the tall grass of the surrounding field, his figure swallowed by the night. When the police arrived, they found no evidence beyond faint footprints, and the door left ajar. Nothing was stolen, yet it was clear the intruder was searching for something specific. It dawned on you that whoever this was, they knew the house. Perhaps they even knew your mother. Their repeated visits, coupled with their willingness to enter despite your presence, left you shaken to your core. Selling the house became your only option, and within weeks, you were gone, leaving the farmland, and the lurking figure, behind. Yet the lingering questions remain. What were they looking for? And what might have happened if you hadn't woken up that night?